Now we are going to move to the next presentation, next seminar by Dr. David Paydarfar. David is the chair of the Department of Neurology at Dell Medical School. He's also the director of the Mulva Clinic for the Neuroscience at the University of Texas at Austin. First time I met David, I met a physician scientist. That's what I was expecting. After I talked to him, I had to go back and check his bio to make sure that he wasn't a computer scientist. He has deep knowledge about many fields, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Roosevelt. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the TAMEST organizing committee for inviting me. I also want to thank the next slide. Here we go. Yeah, this is also really a key slide, which really is one of the big take-home messages, which is that little parts of everything I'm going to show you, there were a large number of individuals in applied mathematics and computational physiology, bioengineering, neonatology, and other areas. And so this bringing together of a common group that can speak a language that relates to medicine and convincing funding agency, and Clayton Foundation actually was partially responsible for bringing me from Massachusetts to Texas. So really wonderful acknowledgement of that. The other thank you is to the previous speakers who have really made my talk much easier because they've laid the foundation of many of the things that I'll touch on, which will help my talk go faster. So what I want to go over in the next 15, 20 minutes is really, I want to first talk about the clinical method of Osler. Now, when I showed a colleague of mine who actually trained at Hopkins this title, he says, well, this is kind of disrespectful to Sir William Osler, sort of the founder of modern clinical method. And I said, well, it's a play on beyond the Turing limit, the supra-Turing computation. So there's sort of an inside kind of point of practicing medicine beyond the Osler limit, which is not meant to minimize the contributions of Osler, but rather can we address some key problems in medicine right now. The second is I wanted to explain in one or two slides how I got interested in this. I'm a neurologist, and I really got interested in the cognitive physiology, the neurophysiology of circuits in the brain that are underlying error and in rapid decision making. Then I'm going to give you two examples as just stories, clinical stories, in the spirit of Osler. And then I want to end with potential for digital twin technology and digital twins to improve outcomes. So very clinically oriented in this talk. So really just by way of introduction, this is a photo of Osler at Hopkins. He created the first academic medical center as we know it. He was very driven by safety, patient safety. The term house officer, which refers to resident physicians, the term resident physician, they actually lived in the unit. They didn't leave. And so many of you who are a part of medical education know that he was under enormous pressure to test this model at Hopkins. Hopkins was the only place he could find that really welcomed his view that the clinic, the hospital, and even the community is the classroom. That is the classroom. That's where the data is gathered, the experiments are done, but we're taking care of patients. He also believed very strongly in the importance of viewing the patient as the teacher, that the professors were really guiding principles and the patient was actually the teacher. If you just look, one of his famous quotes, observe, record, tabulate, communicate, use your 5 senses. Sounds like biosensor networks. Learn to see, learn to hear, learn to feel, learn to smell, and know that by practice you can become expert. Sounds like a generative AI and in the modern era. But the issue really that got me interested in this particular topic is, what are the limits of accurate and timely diagnosis and intervention based on complex multimodal data streams? So for example, in order for me to be here and to talk to you, I had to figure out how to use this thing. I'm making mistakes. I had to make sure my slides were the right order, which button is which. And then I make mistakes, and I have to learn from that right on the fly. So it's really a multimodal time series is what it is. In the case of the body, it's physiological time series that involve multiple physiological functions. So this gets to how I got interested as a neurologist with a background in the physical sciences, is that if I make a mistake pressing one of these buttons, in my vertex brain, I can measure with EEG event potentials a very significant, that red squiggle is the error potential. It's a massive network that activates when I recognize I've made a mistake. This gets to the question about hallucinations and so forth. There is a mechanism in the brain that's very widespread and has been mapped out to the prefrontal medial frontal lobe in humans with fMRI and with EEG. This is a surface EEG that's of this recording showing topographically. It's right on the top of the head, right here. And there are very interesting models. Here's a recent review of the error potential that then feeds back to look at attention mechanisms. I have to attend to the error and attend to what I'm doing to focus on correcting it. And then correcting to get better outcomes. And this is part of a learning adaptive mechanism that the human brain uses to improve performance. The problem with this is there are several problems. One is there's a time delay. I think in fine print it may say something like 70 milliseconds, but that's just the time delay for the error potential. Every one of these has a time delay. Gets to the previous talks on time delays with robotics and trying to anticipate how can we possibly integrate these time delays. It turns out that there is a hierarchy of oscillations for every one of these circuits, ranging from the high frequency gamma in the up to 100 hertz all the way to slower waves of a fraction of a hertz. In fact, the respiratory rhythm of breathing is a sub-hertz rhythm that projects upward to help coordinate. So even every breath that you take interoceptively does help to coordinate. That helps speed it up and synchronize things faster. The problem is that most experiments doing multiple activities simultaneously, like using your cell phone when you're driving, doesn't matter how expert you are, you're at higher risk of an accident. That's been shown many times. But in the case of practicing medicine, when there's multimodal data streams of different sources, different kinds of sensory inputs, this starts to break down. And the error rate goes way up. So the next part is to give you some clinical examples of some things that the individuals that I acknowledged at the beginning were working on. These are extremely difficult problems, requires quite interdisciplinary expertise. And so I really want to emphasize this point here that the examples is to build mechanistically based models of disease dynamics into the anticipatory algorithms and computational methods to create what ultimately comes down to the potential for digital twins to improve outcomes. I want to really make that connection. And I'll just use two examples, preterm infants and acute stroke, two of several that we're working on. So for preterm infants, I want to briefly just kind of mention that here's a preterm infant in the neonatal intensive care unit. How many of you have been in an ICU? Yeah, so prematurity is 1 in 10 live births. It's very common. Prematurity as a biological disease condition does not care about demographic background, does not care about wealth, does not care how compulsive somebody is about taking their multivitamins and taking a good diet, controlling blood. It affects about 1 in 10. There's a range. There are obviously things that can increase the risk, but even people who behave perfectly, they are at risk of having preterm birth. It hits everybody. So it's a very important condition that I just showing an example of a we actually take continuous video and multi-physiological recordings that are recorded on the monitors in the unit. And this is an example of an apnea where the respiratory rhythm, which is generally normal, it just suddenly stops spontaneously. And that leads to a drop in oxygen and a slowing of the heart rate. And this apnea, bradycardia, hypoxia occurs in over 70% of preterm infants in the NICU and is associated with poor neurological outcomes. And in practicing neurology, lifelong disabilities, including 30% of preterm infants will, despite the excellent care and reduction in mortality, 30% will have poor neurological outcomes, including the ones listed here. The mortality for prematurity in the United States used to be over 50%. The mortality's come down to about 20%, but the morbidity and lifelong disabilities has been extremely prominent and a cost to society. So the question is, in just this one example of just one condition, can we predict and prevent apnea episodes? But the other part, which is lost in looking at one infant, is if you were to visit a neonatal ICU, many of you have, raise your hand, but if you were to visit, it would look something like this, more or less modern, depending on when the hospital was built. And you have, this actually is pretty typical, you have staff with lots of infants in pods, and not only does each monitor have multi-data streams, but there are multiple pods. And they have to wash their hands to handle an infant. There's enormous multitasking going on continuously. And these are shift workers. That's the staff and the nursing staff, the physicians, everybody is on shift work, and so you can imagine the potential for error. And so this seems like a perfect, I mean, obviously the advanced care is impressive, but it's a perfect system to study an immature physiological control system. It's a laboratory. As Osler said, this is a laboratory to study. How can we improve things? So I just want to in a brief slide before I go to my second example, I wanted to just give you a snapshot of what we're working on and how we're trying to tackle this. This is an extremely difficult problem, but one thing that's on our side is that we know some of the mechanisms underlying, let's say, apnea, bradycardia, and hypoxia. We understand gas diffusion laws of the lung and how that relates to the rhythm of breathing. We believe that the rhythm of breathing is controlled by a noisy limit cycle oscillator, which can be modeled and validated in animals and in humans. So there are certain mechanistic rules that can be built into this pipeline. Now, I'm calling it a pipeline because all the arrows are pointing in this direction. I want to just point out one thing, which is a very important barrier to this kind of research, and that is that everything you're seeing right here has to occur on the edge. It can't be on the cloud. These are personalized data sets. This is relating to that infant. It has to be highly secure within a hospital environment. The GPUs have to be local. Yes, we can use GPUs, let's say, for each channel that monitors oxygen, ECG. These are very high frequency sample rates that have to be, algorithms that have to be very quick and fast because we're trying to predict things that are occurring in 1 minute from now. We're trying to forecast. And we're trying to figure out how these signals, which obviously there are many elements to this analysis. One is the signals themselves. How do you process the raw signals? And these are up to 500 hertz sample rates. How do you then create your physiological models and refine the parameters of those models? This is the limit cycle of the respiratory rhythm, but there's also how that links to gas exchange and how that links to heart rate as a dive reflex. And then going on to do predictive modeling, and these are actually from publications that are, I don't have the reference here for you, but happy to provide that. But we're getting quite good accuracies when you compare to the error rate, because we know the error rate that clinicians make when they miss, because they're trying to keep track of all these. There's alarm fatigue, there's other error conditions. So we have a way to compare. And these are actually not bad when it comes to predictive modeling. And then, but the problem is, well, we're trying to impact outcomes. So we have to link this model to actual very important clinical questions. And this all has to occur on the edge. But we've got now, this has been running now from the NICU into TAC now for about 1.5 years. We just passed the 250,000 recording hours, and we are now up to several terabytes. It's about a 1.5 gigabytes per day per infant, because you got all these channels. And but we have to de-identify that to get it on TAC, to get the army of mathematicians and computers just to work on the modeling and parameter fitting. And by the way, the glue to all of this is graduate students from the Odin Institute, really doing fantastic work. And so I just wanted to point out that there's this very interesting interplay between the edge computing, which has to be fast and powerful, and cloud computing, which then informs what's happening to that infant and personalizing it to that infant. And then it has to update the model continuously. So I wanted to just pause and shift gears to a second example that we've been working on, which is really relates to a previous talk, actually, about time and brain. And in this particular example, we're talking about a clot that's going into one of the main arteries called the middle cerebral artery right here in the brain. This is a stylized cartoon. And we have a core area of necrosed, irreversibly damaged brain tissue. And that core is growing very fast to encompass the larger potential stroke if you don't remove that clot or do something. And one of the previous speakers talked about the really cool robotic system for, but we have experts who go in with catheters and remove them. We have drugs that we give to the whole body, but those have risks and they're not as effective. And not all patients actually have a clot demonstrated. So it could be that the procedure itself wasn't even going to be effective because there's no clot yet found, and the clots broke off and went peripherally. So there are many factors that involve here. One of the big ones is collateral flow. You see these collaterals here. And I just wanted to quote Jeff Saver from UCLA, who famously wrote, "Time is brain quantified. In each minute, 1.9 million neurons, 14 billion synapses, 12 kilometers of myelinated fibers are destroyed." And this is just a remarkable, and the computational model for this process is actually pretty well defined. And so we know the mechanism for the growth of the core. It relates to both flow-dependent properties as well as diffusive properties, and metabolism, mitochondrial function, apoptosis. Those have largely been worked on in animal models. And to really simplify, from a clinical perspective, here we have imaging, actually, that can be done in most emergency rooms. Most emergency rooms in even the most remote community hospitals now have the capability of creating this map from a CAT scan. And this will image the infarct core. That's the irreversible core. And this is the potential tissue at threat. And one can look at a ratio. And here's a plot based on the best available modeling, which actually is quite remarkably, it can be reduced dimensionally to a simple exponential function of infarct core volume growth exponentially to the green area, which is this limit. And which curve it goes on depends on how much collateral flow there is. And now there's technology being developed that in the ambulance, one can measure collateral flow using ultrasound technology. So we might get even a good estimate. Right now, this is pretty much a stochastic equation. The tau and the volumes are all distributions, not single deterministic. And so just going now, okay, well, what's the conundrum? I think there was a great question about communities that are not urban, that are actually fairly remote. And so we have Travis County, we've got Bastrop County, and there are distances that have to be covered. So here we have the brain map. We understand the brain map, but how do you map the brain part of this to the geophysical, like where should the ambulance go? Like literally, where should they go? Should they go to, as summarized here, in any given location where the stroke started, the patient, should they go to the closest hospital that can give the drug? That's the drug, that's all they can give, but they don't have the expertise to go in with the catheter to pluck it out. Or should they, if there is a clot sitting in the vessel, then they would transfer to a place that has it. But then they've lost time. That's longer, a much longer time. The stroke has grown far. Versus, should they just go directly, but a further distance to the place that has everything? And that's the conundrum, and that's the tension. So that is amenable to an optimization algorithm to predict using prior knowledge of this patient, whatever's available, everything that's available, to try to estimate which one of these two choices and to map that in real time. This requires very rapid computation and interactive information flow from the hospital systems to the ambulances and the expert to then decide. And again, algorithmically, it can be guiding principle. So this just now goes to the actual creation of this computational model and incorporating that into a statistical model, which then predicts where would be the best outcome for the patient. Because we know the volume of the stroke correlates with how well the patient does at 90 days, at 100 days, and so forth, and a year. And so we're calibrating the model and all of the decisions to the physiology and the traffic patterns and where should you go right now with the latest information. The information's flowing in. We don't get all the information at once. It comes in trickles. Suddenly they hook up the ECG and the patient's in atrial fibrillation. Well, that might change the probability distributions. So everything has to be on the fly and rapid. And again, the key is edge computing because it's that patient. So we've done this for Travis County, which is relatively urban, and this is our current county, and Bastrop County, which is rural, and we've mapped it out to where are the hospitals. And you can see the heat map of, based on the best outcomes, where should you go? And these are two different patients, two different pieces of information, and the maps are all different based on the best available information. So just in the last two slides, I wanted to just show that we wanted to do an actual trial here in Texas, but given our current healthcare system, getting the full data sets has been challenging. We do have a bilateral agreement with Travis County EMS, but you have to make these agreements as one-offs. But we have a bilateral agreement, and Travis County has fitted every ambulance with an RF pulse where we can see where they are. It's kind of like the air traffic control where you see where every plane is. So we can see them, we're getting data in real time, and we can map our system to they have their own electronic medical record, so we know exactly when the 911 call occurred. So that infrastructure is now in place. When we published our first paper, a group in Canada got very excited, and they already beat us to it. So this second paper is from British Columbia, which has urban and rural, with Vancouver and rural areas. And they showed literally that if this approach was implemented, it would actually increase the number of excellent outcomes. They estimated about 2 million Canadian dollars per year of cost savings, just hospital savings, because length of stay would go down. The hospital saves money. And then they showed how it improves the volume. I don't know if anyone has been to an emergency room lately in an urban center, but it's like a war zone because everybody tends to go right there. But actually, sometimes it's better not to go there. And you want to know which patient should go there. And so this actually would improve congestion in emergency rooms and put care to where the patient would be served best with the best outcomes based on a mechanistic model. So we're interested in implementing that in this region to see how that goes. So just in conclusion, in the remaining few seconds, I just wanted to just say this really is an exciting time, and we really need standards for how to build digital twins. And it's really important to be successful in creating this digital twin concept, to have an agreed upon standard. And we are so fortunate that the National Academy has just published under Professor Wilcox's leadership and the writing committee, this wonderful document that just came out where the basic framework for digital twin technology, and the question is, okay, how do we implement that for specific examples? And they've given us a very nice direction on the sort of framework to think about in terms of working on local and national scales for trials and showing the benefit of a digital twin method for this, for practicing medicine beyond the Osler limit. Thank you.